Welcome to this panel discussion, Hong Kong on the Edge, Actors and Observers, Part 2. It's a co-presentation of Hong Kong University's Center for Globalization and Cultures and the Washington, D.C. International Film Festival. I'm Linda Blackerby, Senior Program Consultant to the festival. These panels are on the occasion of the U.S. premiere of We Have Boots, the essential new documentary film by director Evans Chan. The International Film Festival Rotterdam presented the world premiere of We Have Boots in January as a feature in their Ordinary Heroes Made in Hong Kong, a section devoted to examining Hong Kong through its cinema. We Have Boots is streaming from the DC Film Festival's website, filmfestdc.org, starting Friday, June 26th through Thursday, July 3rd. It's in our international competitive section, Justice Matters, which is supported by the Cross Currents Foundation. We're recording on June 20th, 2020 in the morning Hong Kong time. Many thanks to the Center and to Gina Marchetti for hosting this panel and to our distinguished panelists for their collaborations. I'm honored to provide brief introductions. Emily Lau was the first woman elected to the Hong Kong Legislative Council in direct elections. A popular politician, she promoted democratic human rights and equal opportunities in Hong Kong, and in 2012 became the chairperson of the Democratic Party. She left her party positions in 2017 and returned to working as a television journalist. Michael C. Davis is a former Hong Kong University law professor who recently led the 2020 report, The Promise of Democratization in Hong Kong, Discontent and Rule of Law Challenges, for the National Democratic Institute. Among his many affiliations, he is also a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University, and a professor of law and international affairs at India's O.P. Jindal Global University. Lawyer and writer Anthony Daparin is a long-term resident and expert observer of dissent in Hong Kong. His writings have appeared in The Atlantic, New Statesman, Foreign Policy, and The Guardian, among many others. His most recent book is the highly regarded City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong, which is considered an essential guide to fight for the very soul of the city. Gina Marchetti, who will be moderating this panel, is a professor at Hong Kong University's Comparative Literature Department and director of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures. Her books include From Tiananmen to Times Square, Transnational China and the Chinese Diaspora on Global Screens, Citing China, Politics, Postmodernism, and World Cinema, and Yellow Peril, Race, Sex, and Discursive Strategies in Hollywood Fiction. Evans Chan, director of We Have Boots, is a New York and Hong Kong-based critic, librettist, and acclaimed independent filmmaker of more than a dozen fiction and documentary films. Congratulations on the US premiere of We Have Boots, Evans.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be able to moderate the panel today on Evans Chan's We Have Boots, and we've got we have some wonderful guests that have already been introduced to us by Linda, so thank you, Linda, for introducing everyone. I want to start with a question for Evans. Could you talk a little bit, it's been 5 years since you made your last documentary, or 5 years have elapsed since the period covered by your last documentary, Raise the Umbrellas. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the political mood during the umbrella movement and the mood today, or the kinds of things that you've seen happening that We Have Boots covers.
When I was making Raise the Umbrellas, I felt that I was making a film about social movement. And actually, I started off making Boots sometime in 2017. I just want to do a short companion piece to Raise the Umbrellas. And as I start talking to all these protagonists in the film, and I realized that it's very much on their mind about their probable jail time, you know, the upcoming trial and all that. And of course, by the time I finished editing the film, I mean, the film was finished practically a week before its premiere at Rotterdam. So that's why you even have footage from the New Year's Eve scene in Hong Kong, yeah. And I had that feeling by the time I finished editing the film. Raise the Umbrella is about social movement. And We At Bush is already a film about human rights because I mean, we see very real, what we understand to be persecution going on, or limiting of political freedom, freedom of speech, you know, and all these basic rights that are generally recognized in most Western democracy. And it, to some extent, was not seriously prosecuted even under the British. So I felt that, you know, that was the main difference in making these two films. And I derive no pleasure in making that distinction.
Could I ask just a very brief follow-up? Because you've talked before about the relationship between seeing your films as social movement documentaries versus human rights documentaries. And I was wondering if you could just comment on that briefly in relationship to the two films.
Oh, I mean, as I said, you know, the main thing is with Raise the Umbrellas, you see a bunch of people, a social movement with very clear objective. Even though it was defeated, we don't see the level of police repression as we saw in We Are Bush, as we saw in Hong Kong, basically in the post-umbrella era. So we see that tightening. I mean, that even censorship is tightening a lot. I mean, I had an easier time, for example, to show Raise the Umbrella in Hong Kong. And by the time an earlier cut of We Are Bush, you know, I had a harder time. And now even when I'm trying to work with two media outlets in Hong Kong to stream it in Hong Kong, because, you know, the DC Filmfest and Sheffield are both geo-blocked for those respective countries. Even when I'm trying to work with them, I was told already I have to delete one segment about the national anthem because, I mean, it already, that national anthem law was passed. And so it's already becoming illegal. And they were very honest with me, even if they put it on their website, this Hong Kong media outlet, if the national security law is really passed in this month, coming weeks, they will take my film down.
Yes, thank you. Let me move on now to Emily Lau. And I want to introduce a brief segment from Raise the Umbrellas, in which Emily Lau talks about, brings us back to the beginning of where we are today in many ways, with a discussion of Margaret Thatcher's visit with Deng Xiaoping. So could we show that now?
In December of 1984, then Prime Minister Maggie Thatcher, she traveled to Beijing to sign the Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong. And then 2 days later, she came to Hong Kong to hold a press conference. Well, when I was a journalist, and I said, Prime Minister, 2 days ago, you signed an agreement with China promising to deliver over 5 million people into the hands of a communist dictatorship. Is that morally defensible? She, of course, was prepared for the question. She said, what do you mean? Britain has done her best. We have done our level best for you, Hong Kong. And everyone in Hong Kong is happy with the agreement, and you may be a solitary exception. If you read 1984, George Orwell's book, solitary exception is a definition for insanity.
Okay, Emily, thank you
Hi.
for this sharing this with us through Evans's film. And I'm wondering if you could comment on, once again, then and now, 1984, 2014, and today.
Well, of course, that was quite a long time ago. Some people think I'm 100 years old. Well, anyway, Maggie is no longer here, but I'm still around. And someone just asked me the other day, he said, Emily, did you seriously think like that in 1984, that such calamity would descend upon Hong Kong? I said, of course I did. I said, what do you mean? We're talking about a communist dictatorship. And of course, actually, the grip that the Communist Party had on its people, including Hong Kong, is getting tighter and tighter. So I think what I said in 1984 was very valid and still very valid today. And whenever I mention this to the UK government, nobody dare to talk back to me. And so it is very sad. And as we speak, some of you are in Hong Kong, others are not. You should know that we are speaking from a very terrified, very anxious, and very apprehensive city. Why? Because people are waiting for the so-called Parliament of China, the NPC, National People's Congress, Standing Committee, to rubber stamp this national security law for Hong Kong, which the European Parliament said yesterday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said so, and also many other countries, the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, they've all said that national security law is in breach of the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Hong Kong Basic Law, which is our mini constitution. It was propagated by Beijing. We had no say in it. We had no say in the Joint Declaration. We had no say in the Basic Law. But we were promised that, as Deng Xiaoping, at that time, the paramount leader, told Hong Kong people who were trembling, and Deng said, don't be afraid. But we will definitely take Hong Kong back in 97. No doubt about it, in spite of what the Iron Lady wanted. But don't worry, because Beijing will not send cadres to run Hong Kong. The horse racing will continue, the people will continue dancing under the Communist Party's policy of one country, two systems for 50 years, from 97 until 2047. Under this policy, Hong Kong people will continue to enjoy the freedoms, the rule of law, personal safety, independence of the judiciary, which the people in mainland China cannot and will not enjoy. So you will be left alone and you can develop democratic government. So those were the promises. But now, when Evans made that documentary on the occupation, and then now with all this chaos in Hong Kong, people are very worried that all those promises were just pieces of waste paper. The promises are being broken, and we are very worried. So that is the scene. So what I said in 1984, I think is very valid, and I'm pleased. Everybody was quite shocked to see the UK government coming out to say, okay, now, Communist Party, if you foist that law on Hong Kong, the UK will act. We will allow the people who hold the British national overseas passports, the BNO, to come to UK, to stay, to study, to work, live for 5 years, and then they can earn their citizenship. You know, I used to say, BNO, what does it mean? It means Britain says no. Now maybe they will say yes. We don't take nothing for granted. I told the people, I said, well, let us wait and see. But since Britain has said that, but they say it if China foists the law on us. So if China suddenly listen to the world and say, okay, it was a mistake, we're going to withdraw it, then Britain may also withdraw the proposal. And that, I think that would make very many people very disappointed and very angry.
Let me ask a very brief follow-up, because one of the things that really struck me in Boots was the fact that Evans presents a portrait of Agnes Chow, a young woman who's very involved in politics now. And you were the first elected woman to LegCo when Hong Kong was still a British colony. And I'm curious if you could just compare what you think are the challenges perhaps facing young women today that differ from the challenges you faced when you were in LegCo.
Well, actually, when I was in LegCo since 91, I didn't have too many challenges because everybody treated me as a human being. And of course, you have to, to know what you're doing and stand up for yourself. So nobody play tricks on me. And I think that's what we should all be prepared for if we go into politics or into anything else. But today, now I stepped down from the Legislative Council after serving for a quarter of a century. I fought 7 elections. I have never lost a single election, but I stepped down in 2016. And now the situation is very different. And as I said, the people are very, very nervous and very angry. And almost every day or every other day, we see people protesting. They are not afraid of being arrested or being beaten up by the police. They are, but of course, I don't support violence. And my friends in the international community kept telling me, say, Emily, now you go back, like Chris Patton and others, go back and tell them, we don't support violence. I said, Governor, of course I know. But some of these people did that, resorted to it. They have to be responsible for their behavior. But for people who go into politics, men or women, they have to be very brave. They could be disqualified, so they couldn't go in like Agnes was, or they could be beaten up. They could be arrested and charged. And there are a number of legislators who have been arrested. Their trials are going on. And with this national security law, we don't know what's going to be in it. And some of the puppets in Hong Kong, National People's Congress delegates, they say, if you're going to be arrested by the national security people who will come to Hong Kong and they will not abduct, but they will take you back to mainland China for trial, then all these things could happen. And you know what happened to the dissidents, the lawyers, the journalists in the mainland who were arrested and persecuted? They could disappear for years. They could be tortured, and they would have no access to their families, no access to lawyers, no access to no one. And that's why Hong Kong people are so frightened. If we are going to be abducted or if we're going to be arrested and sent to mainland China for trial, maybe by then you can kiss yourself goodbye. And we don't know what are the penalties. Some of the penalties could be imprisonment for 10 years or for life, or some could be death penalty. So this is really turning the whole one country, 2 systems on its head. So our friends, wherever you are in the international community, you should understand the pressure and the anxiety and the anger that we are going through. And what's going to happen after, if the law is enacted, and Evan said nobody will show this, maybe I won't be able to talk to you again. And you people, some of you are outside Hong Kong, maybe you will not be allowed to come here. So it is a very, very worrying situation.
Yes, it is. Let me move on now to Michael. And I want to ask Michael to talk a little bit about the evolution of where we're at now in terms of the law. And you're a legal scholar. And I think that that's great to pick up on the fears that Emily has voiced and how that relates to where we're at from the evolution of understanding and interpretation of the basic law.
Thank you, Gina. I don't know if the small boxes that we're in show up, but I noticed my daughter's name is in front of me instead of myself. But so people not be confused, I thought I'd point that out. But in any case, I was a little bit behind, I can say one of my big fears in life is to follow Emily Lau as a speaker. So it's realized today. I was a little bit behind Emily in pushing back in the way she mentioned in 1984 in my 1989 book, which was entitled Constitutional Confrontation in Hong Kong. So you can judge from the title that I was predicting exactly what's happening right now, that there's a major contradiction between the mainland system and the Hong Kong system. And one of the things that I think was encouraging to people at that stage, and perhaps Margaret Thatcher as well, is that this one country, two systems model was to spell out in great detail how to keep the mainland system out of Hong Kong. That you can't really think of one country, two systems and this project regarding Hong Kong unless you appreciate that the design was simply that the mainland system harbored principles and rules and practices that would undermine Hong Kong entirely. And so the idea when Deng Xiaoping was telling people to put their hearts at ease was that that mainland system would not be allowed in. And so when they finally wrote the basic law, they included articles in there saying that the departments of the mainland under the central government shall not interfere in Hong Kong affairs, that Hong Kong shall on its own maintain public order in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong on its own, and they use exactly those words, on its own, shall draft national security laws for Hong Kong. So all that was put there. As Emily described it already so well, this was the basic framework of one country, two systems, and Deng Xiaoping invoking the idea that people should put their hearts at ease, that this fear, in the early 1980s, before the Sino-British Treaty, there were a lot of people leaving Hong Kong. They were immigrating. So this promise was used to get them to put their hearts at ease and to settle in. And Hong Kong has thrived. But one of the things that's characteristic of this period between then and now is a constant sort of growing evolution of mainland interference. In the first couple years, they were a little less open about it. They're a little more behind the scenes, trying not to be seen to directing Hong Kong politics and so on. But as time goes on, first, the biggest inkling of their intrusion into Hong Kong was in 2003, when this Article 23 legislation that now is being replaced by the national security law was put forward by the government. Now, it's interesting when the government did that, obviously it was doing Beijing's bidding because this Article 23 legislation was there and Beijing obviously wanted that done. I myself was a member of the Article 23 Concern Group, which is a number of 9 of us who wrote a bunch of pamphlets, and I really endeared myself to my university heads at the Chinese university at the time by being in press conferences every week attacking the Article 23 legislation. But myself and several others who eventually formed what was called the Civic Party had the Article 23 Concern Group and so on, and we wrote a bunch of pamphlets highlighting that the government had completely ignored the principles under the human rights guarantees that apply to Hong Kong, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. We cited what was called the Johannesburg Principles, which highlights how you regulate these kinds of things. Now today, when the Beijing puts forth this national security law, they say, oh, we're doing it because Hong Kong didn't do it. And of course, the Hong Kong government is saying, yeah, we tried, but you Democrats got in the way and stopped us. But that's really an inaccurate account when you think about it, because what the government could have done if it was looking out for Hong Kong is advance the Article 23 legislation in the first place, perhaps by going to the Law Reform Commission, whatever it took, consulting the public, complying with these international standards, and none of this would have happened. Yeah. If people would have said, okay, this government is really trying to do this in a way to protect basic rights in Hong Kong, but that's not what they did. And so I think that was a kind of tipping point in Hong Kong, both for the people of Hong Kong who became aware that the Hong Kong government is not really representing them, but rather it's representing Beijing, and for Beijing who became aware that the street in Hong Kong is going to object if Beijing tries to intrude too much into Hong Kong. So you know, it was interesting when I first taught in Hong Kong in 1985, I asked right after the Sino-British Treaty was signed, I asked my students, what would you do if you were asked? You weren't consulted. So first they rejected my question in the university. They says, well, nobody has asked us about this. And I said, well, humor me. I just arrived from the United States. I'm a stupid American. Go ahead and tell me what you would do if you're given a choice. And it was interesting that the class voted unanimously, and this is an interesting result. They voted that they would have China take back Hong Kong, but then China would hire the British to run it. And so, so this is the politics of Hong Kong circa 1985. Hong Kong is not, you know, a rebel society. It's a very you know, oriented towards business and people taking care of their own business. So what politicized Hong Kong? In my view, what politicized Hong Kong is that Beijing didn't carry out its promises. And why did it not carry out its promises? Well, we can blame Beijing, but I think we should also blame Hong Kong officials and blame Hong Kong's pro-establishment elite, because in an autonomous regime, and that's what this was, it's the job of the government and established leaders in the society to protect the autonomy of the society. And it became clear with his Article 23 proposals, and then it became clear later on when they were doing Beijing's bidding in other ways over railroads going into Hong Kong, over treating Hong Kong officials very specially in border regions in terms of buying goods, and then dragging their feet over democracy and saying that Hong Kong people weren't ready for it and so on. And we saw that in the 2014 protests. And then finally, literally coming up with this extradition bill that would send Hong Kong people across the border. So this progression from a put your hearts at ease to what it is today, Beijing is the boss, is actually in many ways orchestrated by Hong Kong officials. And one of the things that I find most outrageous in this recent episode, this national security law, these officials are now telling us, oh, it's going to be narrowly drawn, don't worry about it. And then they say, oh, only in the rare case will somebody be hauled across the border and prosecuted. Who can believe that? I mean, the mainland system of public security laws, the number of people in jail, the professors that are arrested, the journalists that are arrested, is infamous. Who would believe this? And then they say, but don't worry, we'll still have the basic law and the courts will protect us. Are the courts of Hong Kong going to overturn a mainland law that violates people's rights? Of course not. They're not going to do it, because that law, the mainland officials have long attacked Hong Kong courts, even for reviewing local laws under the basic law, saying, well, you're not supposed to have constitutional review. This is executive-led government and not separation of powers. They attack it every time. Well, what do you think would happen to a court who deigned to actually try to overturn or say part of the mainland national security law is unconstitutional? It just wouldn't be allowed. Beijing has already established the power to overrule the court when it comes to these rulings on the basic law. The final power of interpretation in the basic law, Article 158, is in the National People's Congress Standing Committee. So the courts will be powerless to protect people. And you can imagine if they're going to actually set up local branches of the Public Security Bureau of the mainland China in Hong Kong. If those officials investigate people here, challenge people, charge people, is the court going to be in any position to stop them? If they want to send someone across the border, is that court going to stop them? Of course not. And one of the big problems here is they say, well, rule of law will be upheld. But the rule of law means you know what the law is. Who's going to know what the law is? And who's going to know if whatever they're doing on the boundaries of this law is going to get them sent across the border? They won't know. Oh, am I the rare case? Well, I don't know. So maybe I better shut up entirely. And so the whole design of this poses a fundamental threat to Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy, or promised high degree of autonomy. The high degree of autonomy, which we must remember, is primarily designed to protect the rule of law in Hong Kong. When you do opinion polls in Hong Kong, the most popular thing in Hong Kong, it's not the Legislative Council where Emily serves so greatly. it is the rule of law. People in Hong Kong want the rule of law to protect them. The idea that even their officials are subject to the law. So this is what's at stake. And this is the only common sense way to understand what was done in the one country, two systems framework, that it must have been with the purpose of guarding this rule of law in Hong Kong, which is so important to Hong Kong. I'll add one last footnote.
Sure.
One thing people haven't paid attention to much is the fact that Beijing is now pressuring company heads, corporations, officials, elites, pretty much the entire pro-establishment camp, to declare their support for the law. So what you're seeing is the identifying of friends of Beijing in even the commercial area. So with this, how can you have a level playing field and a free market in Hong Kong? What does this say to international business and other people who have their regional headquarters in Hong Kong or are thinking about setting up in Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong going to be a level playing field when you have to declare your allegiance to a Beijing law? We're even told possibly legislative council candidates may have to declare they support this national security law, or they'll even be denied the right to run. So the idea even of a level playing field in politics or business is now in question. So it's not just a high degree of autonomy and the rule of law, but it's all these other things that make this fabulous city we call Hong Kong what it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I was particularly disturbed by the fact that so many of the vice chancellors of the universities were among the first to write a statement in support of a law that hasn't even been publicized yet. So
Right.
I think the pressure is there, and it's
Yeah.
pretty clear, and that it goes far beyond elected representatives and the government and the business community, that it's also creeping into the university systems and the school system, which has become very controversial now.
Well, I'm just waiting to see which public official in Carrie Lam's cabinet might finally hold their finger over their nose and release it, I guess I should say, and actually resign because of what's being done to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I call on all of them to consider that.
Yeah, that's something that I've been wondering about, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later. Let me move on to ask Anthony you've written 2 books on protest culture here in Hong Kong, and I'd like you to maybe comment on 2014 versus 2019 on the material covered in Raise the Umbrella, and then now the new material or the new way of looking back on the years since the umbrella movement through Boots.
Yeah, certainly. I think probably the first point to make by way of background is that culture and cultural expression has been a central part of Hong Kong social movements going back for decades, at least to the handover, if not earlier. And it's one of the things that Evans has covered so well in his films. It's also something that I think is important not to overlook when we look at the umbrella movement. And one of the most common misconceptions you hear about the umbrella movement of 2014 is that it was a failure. And people say that because it didn't achieve the direct political aims that it was agitating for. But as I say, I think that's very much a misconception for 2 reasons. The first is because of the political awakening that clearly the umbrella movement prompted in a whole generation of Hong Kong's youth. And that's what I think We Have Boots shows so beautifully, that evolution from the disappointment of the umbrella movement through to not just the police state and the sort of reign of terror that was a consequence of that, but also the hope and the activism, people like Agnes Chow and Tommy Jung and the other young localists all becoming politically active in their own way directly as a consequence of the umbrella movement. And that was, I think, one of the great victories of the umbrella movement. But the other great victory of the umbrella movement was the cultural expression that came out of that movement. And in some ways now, looking back at the umbrella movement, I see it just as importantly as a cultural movement than as a political movement. And now the umbrella movement and the occupied spaces that were created in the umbrella movement were very famously spaces for cultural expression. You had the artwork, the posters, various performances, cinema screenings that happened in the occupied spaces, and the way that the occupation remade the urban space itself was an incredible act of cultural expression. And then in the wake of the umbrella movement, it prompted really an outpouring of creativity in Hong Kong. And Evan's films are just one example of that, but there have been many other wonderful documentary films, pieces of cinema, theater, artworks and literature, all inspired by the umbrella movement and by the political environment in Hong Kong. And so that's, I think, is a very important aspect of the umbrella movement. But then, of course, that has evolved over the 5 years, now coming up on 6 years since the umbrella movement. So when we came to the protests of last year, again, cultural expression played a very important part. The Lenin walls that were in just one location during the umbrella movement in Admiralty blossomed all over the city, and we saw incredible expressions of artwork and graffiti and posters, and both online and offline expressions of culture that were produced in the course of last year's protests, but also a distinct darkening in tone from what we saw of the very utopian, optimistic tone of the umbrella movement to a quite desperate tone, a very dark, dystopian tone among last year's protests. And the reasons behind that, I think, are very clear in Evans's film. This dark turn towards the direction that Hong Kong is heading and the increasing repression that people here are facing. And so I think it's wonderful that Evan's film provides the background to explain all of this cultural expression. And I think what it all really comes back to is this idea of identity and identity building. And I think that the Hong Kong protest movements throughout its recent history, but especially from the umbrella movement through to the present day, is been about building a distinct Hong Kong identity that distinguishes Hong Kong from the rest of China and wants to preserve this idea that Hong Kong is somewhere distinct and special. And cultural expression is a way of defining that Hong Kong identity. And really what we're ultimately talking about, and I think this is really where We Have Boots is so important, is this idea of nation building. And just to be very clear, I'm not talking about nation states. I'm not talking about the idea of Hong Kong independence, but purely the idea of a Hong Kong people, a Hong Kong unique identity within the broader state of China, but that the Hong Kong people are a nation, a people that have their own unique identity. And cultural expression has been such an important way of nation building in Hong Kong, whether it's the artworks, whether it's statues like the Lady Liberty statue that was developed last year, whether it's this song "Glory to Hong Kong," which you see in beautifully performed in a number of different forms in We Have Boots. This is these cultural icons are things that people have rallied around, have taken as part of the core of a unique Hong Kong identity, and to form the foundations of this Hong Kong nation building that we have seen evolve from the umbrella movement through to the present day, and I think which the two films do such a good job of documenting and unpacking and explaining.
Thank you. I have just a very brief follow-up, because you mentioned the music. And the music is very striking in We Have Boots. Could you talk just a little bit more about the way in which music is used in the film and your own impressions of, going a little bit perhaps beyond Glory to Hong Kong, which is quite striking in the way it was conceived and composed and developed and the way it's used in the film. Yes. But perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, certainly. Music has been actually a key aspect of cultural expression in protest movements, going back in history through Hong Kong. And it's interesting to compare the umbrella movement music with the 2019 protest movement music. The umbrella movement had very optimistic music reflecting the utopian nature of the movement. And again, you hear this song "Raise the Umbrellas" in We Have Boots, and also in obviously the theme of the very title of the first film, "Raise the Umbrellas." This was a canto pop style, upbeat, joyous song designed to rally people's spirits and express solidarity with the movement. And many of the other songs that came out of the umbrella movement era were this sort of upbeat, optimistic types of music. When we came to 2019, with the darkening of the mood, this sort of dystopian mood, the music and the soundtrack to the movement became much darker. And not only did we have Glory to Hong Kong, a somewhat military national anthem style song, we had people also singing from Les Miserables. Do you hear the people sing, hearkening back, of course, to another famous historical protest movement, but also a sense of defiance, but also somewhat despair. People also sang hymns. One very notable hymn, Sing Hallelujah to the Lord, a sort of minor key, very somber hymn that people were using early in the protest last year to try and evoke a sense of peace, but also there was a sense of mourning about it. And then finally, the soundtrack that the protesters would create themselves in the street. And this was something that was very striking, and it's echoed somewhat in some of the soundtrack that Evans uses in We Have Boots, not directly, but this repetitive rhythmic beating. And that was first inspired by the riot police who beat their batons on their shields as an intimidation tactic. And the protesters, I think, picked up on that and then began to beat fixed objects in the street with their umbrellas or with other fixed objects, beat street signs or road dividers to create this rhythmic, death-rattling sound, you know, to create their own idea, their own attempt to intimidate the police, but also to rally spirits in a kind of battle cry. And you hear that echoed in that sort of repetitive, rhythmic soundtrack that Evans uses through We Have Boots as well. And it just there's a sense of agitation in the air and anxiety in the air, really reflecting the mood of the protest movement of last year and going into this year. And such a contrast to that uplifting, optimistic air of 2014.
Thank you. Let me return now to Evans and to ask him to reflect back on an earlier film that he did about the 1997 handover called Journey to Beijing in relationship to We Have Boots. I'm wondering, Evans, if we could do another then and now, not with the Raise the Umbrellas, but with Journey to Beijing and We Have Boots, in terms of how you conceived of these films and how you've seen Hong Kong change.
Yeah, sorry, you know, some of you may not have seen Journey to Beijing, but that was one film I made about the handover, and that was the first independently produced documentary about the 1997 handover. It went to Berlin, went to London, and in a way that such two high-profile film festivals are willing to show the film already shows the difference in terms of how much harder it is for films about Hong Kong to get it out there. I of course, I mean, because Emily talked about 84 and Michael talked about 85. Now we are reaching the midpoint, you know, 97 to today. Of course, I mean, I left Hong Kong in 87. I was pursuing my graduate study, and you know, I was the only child, so my mother was not really willing for me to leave. And so at the time, I sort of, you know, just blame it on 97. You know, I was not really worried. I didn't know how to worry. You know, I just said, oh, you know, 97. And she said, everybody is here. What the hell are you doing? Why do you have to leave? But then 89 arrived. And actually, interesting enough, I was in China. It was my first trip to visit China. I, you know, returned from, I was back from the US. I was taking this long trip from April through June through China. So in late May, when the curfew was imposed, I actually arrived in Beijing. Couldn't get into the city. All of a sudden, all the roads, all the main thoroughfare into Beijing was blocked. There were tanks being stopped, and all the angry citizens were yelling at the PLA officer, saying, "What are you doing?" So all those tanks were stopped. And of course, I mean, much later we knew that, you know, June 4th was actually an arbitrary date. I mean, the decision to clamp down was made a long time ago. They could not find the right troops who are willing to do it. And in any case, I was in Beijing. I saw, you know, 1 million people taking to the street. And I thought then it's just a waiting game. I think that the authority are just trying to wait it out, let it fizzle out by itself. So I left without any inkling of what was going to happen. And then I went to Shanghai, and then I went to Hangzhou, and then, so June 4th arrived. I was in Hangzhou. And interesting enough, news did travel in China, and then the whole city was in mourning. How many students came up to me telling me that, you know, their friends went to Beijing and they could not, you know, they didn't know what happened to them. They were in tears and all that. So I was very emotional. So me and my friend attached ourselves to an American tour group. We left like in a convoy, and I really felt I was living in a war zone. We were stopped by different people, you know, questioning us. And I was really suspecting that China was going to erupt in civil war, because, I mean, I'm not surprised there was discord among the leadership. So I went back to Hong Kong. I saw this collective gloom. Some, you know, Gina, you would know, actually that's how I made my first film. That was the Hong Kong, caught between China, Britain, and also at the time, the Vietnamese refugees issue, and even America as well. So that became the backdrop to my first film, which is narrative, but with documentary elements. But I was recording all that because I was going to tell you how my mother's response. My mother was illiterate. She was a peasant woman from China. She ended up, I came from very working class background. I mean, she worked as a seamstress in a garment factory. But then she was in tears. She was telling me, you did the right thing to leave. So I really feel this full circle when today, you know, so many people are talking about leaving Hong Kong again. But then, of course, 89, of course, of also the political moment in the Eastern Bloc, you know, all these things easing up, and you don't know. And of course, China had a hard time returning to the international community. And then I think I fell. And I think a lot of people also felt that, you know, China might really learn the lesson and be able to to modernize itself politically. So I think that by 97, I think that mood was not as bad. I mean, actually, you remember before 97, a lot of people have returned. From overseas, I mean, right after 1989, that was the first major exodus of people leaving Hong Kong, you know, mainly to Canada, and not too many to the US because of the immigration quota. But then, you know, by 97, people were coming back. So when I made the film Journey to Beijing, I was following a group of people who were very forward-looking, who were taking a walk from Hong Kong to Beijing to raise funds for foundational education in China. So they thought that they are going to help underprivileged children in China. So these group of people who were the most forward-looking in terms of thinking, actually Hong Kong can help China. Hong Kong can help China modernize China politically, culturally, in so many other ways. So when I look back, you know, because I don't really look at my own film very often, but recently, because people were showing that film again, and I did look at it again, and I was just impressed by how many people were so confident about Hong Kong. Even a police officer was saying, you know, he has done training sections in China, and they are still, you know, have some way to catch up with Hong Kong, but they'll get there. And also at that time, Hong Kong is quote unquote wealthier than China. So that's why, you know, all these people are thinking of raising funds to help the children, the poor children in China. And so, I mean, there are so many ways I see that confidence in terms of being a Hong Kongers, at least among some of them. a certain segment of the population. But I mean, of course, I also interview other people. You know, Martin Lee was in it. You know, and you know, environmentalists were in it. You know, they are all talking about the worries about the future. You know, the political future. You know, all these transitional issues. But I mean, I did feel very strongly that moment. There was a lot of confidence in Hong Kong. And that's why I also want to, you know, at least I want to ask that question. I want to put that to Emily, actually. You know, all these younger generations were blaming anybody who came of age, you know, in 97, at least me. I mean, they were asking me, so you support democratic reunification? I mean, I said, why, who told you that? You know, I mean, it doesn't mean, I mean, I was honestly, at that time, I thought that that may be a bit wishful thinking. But, you know, you look at it in the rosiest light. And anyway, it doesn't mean that it is impossible. So my question for Emily is, you must have faced a lot of criticism for your generation, not giving them more democracy. And I mean, how do you respond? So and also, I mean, of course, the, you know, Michael and also Anthony, you know, when you look back at that midpoint, I don't know where were you, Anthony, at that point, but Michael was in Hong Kong in 97, I assume. So, I mean, maybe, you know, we can compare notes in terms of this changing landscape, because I also feel that the younger people really have no references in terms of what we were going through and why would they arrive at where they were at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, could I ask each panelist, starting with Emily, to please respond?
Yes, well, I'll go first. Well, actually, the same question was put to me by the BBC a few years ago, and it was a midnight interview. So I was sort of half asleep. And then suddenly, during the interview, the person said, "Oh, Miss Lau, you know, some young people said it's all you people's fault because of your failure all these years. That's now why we're in the state we're in." So I woke up immediately and I bang on the desk. I said, "Let me tell you, of course we have not got democracy. We never had democracy. But the level of freedoms, personal safety, and the rule of law that we enjoy is much higher than many places, countries, which have periodic elections. That's the irony of Hong Kong. So, although we have failed to get democratic elections to choose our government, but over the years, the decades, the Hong Kong people, not just me, Emily Lau, or the Democratic Party, but millions of us, we have in our own ways, separately and collectively, tried to stand up to Beijing, stand up to these evil forces to ensure that we can continue to have our free lifestyle. So, had it not been all for all these efforts over the decades, you think now I can talk to you at the BBC and I can talk to you now at the Hong Kong U? Forget it. So these young people may not know, but I want them to understand that it had not been for the efforts of Evans, of everybody making documentaries, taking to the streets, fighting, writing, painting, or whatever, we would not be. Actually, within days, we could be like Macau. Within a week, we'd be like Guangzhou, just another city of China. So I want to tell those people who blame us, I said, forget it. I mean, we tried our best. Had it not been for all our efforts, this conversation cannot even go on. We will all be in prison. We cannot have this discussion. So I don't blame them, but I think it is important, especially some of you are academics and others are filmmakers and so on. You should tell them, tell the world, the older and the younger generation, what happened, what efforts have been made.
Thank you. Michael?
Yes, I think Emily's right. What I tell my students and what we discuss, in many ways, the protesters today stand on the shoulders of the older generation. Now we can say, and I remember that poster inside the Legislative Council when they occupied it said that you guys taught us that nonviolence doesn't work. They put this in a poster, and the idea was that, oh, we had 1 million, 2 million protesters, and Carrie Lam still did not listen to us. And I think what Evan describes is a certain level of optimism. But you know, when I think about it, that optimism especially was, I think, in a belief that if Hong Kong people marched on the streets and protested and conveyed their desires clearly, that Hong Kong's officials would be compelled, if they want to have the public support, compelled to represent them, to move forward and to listen to their calls. And it's interesting over the years, and I've been involved in protests from all the way back to, I was marching in 1989 in Hong Kong. I remember we marched up to Happy Valley and filled the whole space up there. And so I've been involved in this as Emily has, and all these many years. And I think the feeling was that if the Hong Kong government was calling the shot on something, if we protested enough, then they would back down eventually. And so we know they were calling the shot on Article 23 legislation. They had written and drafted it and so on. And Beijing in those days was a little less hands-on. And so eventually we protest, and eventually the Liberal Party pulled the plug on it, which is kind of like me asking today whether any official will step up like the Liberal Party did finally at the last minute and abandon the Article 23 legislation. But the thing we also find over the years is that when Beijing is calling the shots, and it very clearly is the case over democratic reform, all the protests we do in Hong Kong just doesn't seem to do anything. And I think that lesson was well learned in 2014 when that was the direct target of the protest. Even in 2019, eventually the extradition bill was withdrawn that the government had put up. So in some ways you sense the government might have been able to do that or allowed to do that, to withdraw it after all the pressure was put on the government. But when it came to the other four demands, none of it was given in. So you figure that's being called, the shots are being called across the border. So this is the dilemma for Hong Kong. And I think young people need to understand this. In many kinds of social movements and revolutions, you're on the street in front of the government that you're protesting against. But in Hong Kong, like the Tibetans, in some ways, you're protesting in one place, but the government is somewhere else. So you're not posing a risk to that government cannot bear. So it has almost no incentive. So always in these protests over these many years in Hong Kong, in some ways they're directed at the Hong Kong government because that is the only hope that they will listen. Beijing doesn't seem to listen at all. And I think this has been a dilemma. And so, well, did nonviolence work? Maybe our youngsters would say no. But unfortunately, it seems violence is not working either. And so they themselves may be called out by their children someday. How did you lose Hong Kong? So I think this is a problem. And I think many have come to appreciate, and I did a lot of interviews, so I recently wrote a report on Hong Kong. I did a lot of interviews, about 50 of them, of Hong Kong youngsters and others. And many of them have come to understand that alone Hong Kong people can't get Beijing to do anything. And that's why this importance is placed on international support, because international may not get Beijing to do much either. And notice that's why Beijing is targeting international support in the national security bill, because that is the heat that they do not like. And so this is a dilemma. And I think a lot of smart young people that I talk to understand this. And I understand the anger of others sometimes makes it hard for them to understand whose shoulders they're standing on.
Thank you. Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to your question, Evans, in 1997, I was in Beijing midway through 2 years of study at Beijing University there before coming to Hong Kong in 1999 when I began working here. The thing that strikes me comparing then and now is just how differently things have turned out to everyone's expectations, I think both in Hong Kong and in the rest of China. I don't think in 1997 anyone would have expected that China would in many ways be more repressive now than it was then. And certainly that sense of hope that I think there was in 1997 and certainly still around in 1999 when I began working here in Hong Kong, that this could all work and that nothing much had changed and that this one country, two systems thing might just have something to it, and it might just be the answer. Might just a couple of decades later turn out to be so greatly disappointed. And the thing that really strikes me, and Emily may not recall this, but I spoke to Emily on the very last day of the umbrella movement. As Emily, you and several dozen others were sitting on the road there waiting to be arrested as they were clearing the umbrella movement site. And I was asking you what you thought the legacy would be and what would perhaps happen next. And I remember quite clearly that you said, Emily, that you hoped that the younger generation would learn that they would need to become more politically engaged, not just through marching on the streets, but through becoming involved in the formal political system and forming parties and running for elections. And I think the great tragedy is that they tried to do exactly that. But even that has been foreclosed to them, as We Have Boots so clearly documents. And I think that the tragedy of just this constricting public space, that marching on the streets doesn't work, trying to form parties and run through the systems doesn't work. And so every avenue for political expression, every avenue for the younger generation or for the Hong Kong people to be involved in governance of their own city is being foreclosed and narrowed down, and with this national security law now becoming even more restricted. And I think that's a very dark place that none of us expected to find ourselves in from back in 1997.
Thank you. I want to end the session by going back to Evans and talking about the title of the film and the reference to Nikki Giovanni's poem, Where Do You Enter? We have umbrellas, we have boots, we have each other. And I'm wondering, Evans, if you could reflect on the title and the way you've been inspired, and many people in Hong Kong have been inspired by African-American struggles in the United States.
Well, I mean, actually, there are a number of American references in the film. And of course, that did not come from me. I mean, that was what Benny Tai was inspired. And I mean, there was an interesting, I mean, when I was at Rotterdam, there's an Indian journalist coming to interview me. And I was saying actually is an important moment, because if you look at the history of civil disobedience, now you are looking at a global exchange. Actually, Gandhi was before Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King was exposed to Gandhi. And I said, in some way, you're looking at civil disobedience returning to Asia and being introduced by the occupied Sri and being introduced by Benny Tai into Hong Kong. But of course, I mean, he was more explicitly referencing Martin Luther King. Even one of the songs that I used throughout We Have Boots, Go Down Moses, of course, is an important song in the civil rights movement, and it was sung by Marian Anderson. She, had that Lincoln Memorial Concert a decade before Martin Luther King, when she was, all famous in Europe and wasn't allowed to hold a concert in the United States. So that was that important moment when Mrs. Roosevelt, withdraw from the Daughters of the Revolution, the descendants of the female descendants of the founding fathers, which owns that hall, that refused to let Marian Anderson to rent to perform. So in protest, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned, withdrew from that organization. And then the Roosevelt administration came up with the idea of having an open air concert. They carry the piano up those hundreds of steps to the top. And so Marian Anderson, this pioneering Black soprano, she's an alto, stepped forward and sang to 20,000 people. I mean, she was, before, the street tenor, she commanded the whole stage. So, I mean, for her, so she was like a pioneer of the civil rights movement in the United States. And I think to some extent, both in terms of the inspiration, in terms of the struggle for human rights and universal suffrage, I saw a lot of similarity. And that's why I use Nikki Giovanni. I just came across that poem. I just find it very apt. And she was invited by President Obama to write a poem for his inauguration. And she did. And she wrote, the title of the poem is Yes, We Can, Yes, We Can, Yes, We Can. I hope that that kind of optimism will stay with Hong Kong and actually China. I mean, why shouldn't we see China making progress, both economically and in some other areas as well? I mean, who wants China to fail? I don't. I mean, we don't want us to see Hong Kong fail. We don't want to see China fail under whatever circumstances. It's a huge deal, who wants to see China collapse. But I mean, of course, there are many, many problems besetting China today and also besetting Hong Kong. And maybe, the way that China is so motivated to control Hong Kong as much as it can has to do with some internal imperative or internal problems as well. I hope that all these can be resolved. And that's why I feel, I make these two films. And maybe it's testing China, but on the other hand, I mean, if China has nothing to fear, why should it be a problem? And I mean, as I was also coming up with the comparison with Quebec, I mean, come on, I mean, Quebec tried independence many times, they end up staying. And I bet if you allow Hong Kong to vote, Hong Kong will stay. And look at Scotland. So I mean, all these aspirations are nothing to be afraid of. I mean, let's hope that it's just a matter of family squabbles, and I hope that all these tough measures are not necessary. And I just hope that there will be all of us can be more moving forward, more optimistically. Yeah, so, and I also thank you, all the panelists and Gina for doing such a wonderful job, for your participation in the discourse and discussions about Hong Kong and bringing the Hong Kong cases to the world. I'm doing whatever I can, but it's getting very difficult to even make the film in Hong Kong and get it out there, but I'm trying my best. Thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you all panelists.